It is the nature of any being in the world or in the universe that we don't go seeking the answers for things that we think we already have the answer to. I like this video to be very brief. It won't be brief, but I want to talk about one of the sickest delusional, vile priests of the cult of quantum. This guy had 1,000 charisma points, and yet he was one of the dumbest SOBs who ever lived. Bear with me for a second. This guy wrote, his name's Richard Feynman, QED Strange Theory of Light and Matter. I've read all his books. I've been through all his works, and you know, we have to first start off with the premise, and this is of course the case, that it's okay not to know the answer to things. Okay, it's okay not to know. You know, you don't spank a child for not knowing how a car works, or you know, or sticking his hand on the stove and getting burnt. It's like you didn't know. You got to learn. But this demented fool, his stuff is reading materials in colleges all across the world. This guy, admittedly, had an IQ of 125, which I don't really put much, importance into IQs. I mean, IQ tests are pretty irrelevant. There are plenty of autistic people that would never pass an IQ test, and yet they're brilliant in a narrow spectrum of what they do. So that's really not important. But there's a famous video where this dead old SOB, excuse my language, but this guy is pure evil. He is literally nothing other than a sick cult, kind of like the one founded by a science fiction writer, which I won't name, you know, and it has a cult somewhere down in the south of the United States that I'm sure everybody knows. But quantum is nothing other than a sick religion. Anyway, there's an English guy that asks this demonic fool, Feynman. He sits and wiggles in his chair like a worm on a hot plate, like a frog on a hot plate. He asks a really simple question. Let me play it for you here.
What's going on between these two bits of metal? Well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that?
Yeah,
how are
why?
They doing that?
How? Sensible question.
You're asking.
Watch his body movements.
Perfectly reasonable question.
Worms, squiggles.
Okay.
Ooh.
Problem that you're asking. You see, when you ask why something happens,
Yeah, when you ask why.
how does a person answer?
Definition of is. What's the definition of is?
Why? Because she slipped without.
See, he literally goes on and spends another X number of minutes talking about Aunt Minnie slipping on ice. And well, okay, she slipped on ice. So why is ice slippery? I mean, talk about a fallacious dodge if you've ever seen one in your life. This guy has a cult following that is exactly, and I've debated his cult followers, okay? He's got a following exactly like a priest in a cult, okay? They exist in academia. This guy had a really good speaking voice. He loved to had these all little anecdotes for the crowd. He was really good storyteller, and people love charisma more than anything. You know, it might be the case that one of the dumbest people in America is sitting in the White House. He's got 1,000 charisma points, but he has no experience. He got elected twice based upon charisma only. I don't get into politics. I'm not making a political commentary, but it is the case that, you know, for example, the leader of the free world had no experience before getting elected, and that person got elected based upon one thing only: charisma. Okay? This person is exactly like this. And I say it's okay not to know. I've been through all his books. What is so horrible about this? You know, that people believe this. This guy never answered the question. Now, but his followers say, oh, well, he did answer the question. At the very end of the video, he actually says this.
I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to why magnets attract each other, except to tell you that they do.
Oh, okay. So one of the world's leading scientific minds, who's dead now, thank goodness he isn't spitting out any more works, wouldn't wish death on anybody, but I mean, it's okay if he was a demented old fool. People loved him because he had really awesome charisma. That's great, but that doesn't mean this a-hole had any answers for anything, much less magnetism. Now, the people that follow this idiot in the cult of quantum, and it literally is a cult, because in his own book, Okay, you can look up in the index in the back on what mediates out magnetism, and you'll find it underneath virtual particles, virtual photons, page 95, page 120. Now, people in the cult of quantum will say, well, he never actually defined what magnetism is because the questioner just didn't have a developed enough brain to understand. Well, that would have meant that since this book, which was written for his kinsmen in the cult, would have had the answers in it, but it doesn't. It doesn't have the answers. So let's quote his book. Now, this whole video, he worms and squiggles and talks about an old woman slipping on ice as an analogy for magnetism. At the very end, he says, I can't tell you what magnetism is, how it works, which is fine, not to know. But to pretend you know, or to say, well, it's too complicated for you to understand, dear sir. This sort of elitist, intellectual, pseudo-intellectual hypocrisy, makes me puke. Some of the people I love the most, they dropped out, that I've met in life, they dropped out of high school, or, they're just down-to-earth people. They've got a lot of common sense. Obviously, higher education is important, but that doesn't mean someone has wisdom, okay? They might have a lot of empirical knowledge, but if someone doesn't have wisdom, then I'm not interested in much what they had to say. When the supposed expert in Hollywood, which he was a Hollywood scientist, even his cult followers, refer to him as the Hollywood star of science. And, Richard Feynman was asked to explain what magnetism or how it works. He sits there in his chair. He twitches and squirms like a frog in a hot plate. And he eventually concedes that he can't explain these forces. In his book, Q.D. Strange Theory of Light and Matter, he explains the magnetism. Now, this is an important point, okay? He explains away magnetism with angels and unicorns. Well, rather, I should say virtual photons. Okay, let's talk about virtual photons here in a second. Which there is no quantitative difference between unicorns and the sage supposed academic explanation of virtual photons. Both are patently absurd and offend the common sense of a 10-year-old. Because a 10-year-old will go, what's a virtual photon? Oh, well, it's too complicated. I can't explain it to you. But if you actually delve into the papers of these demonic idiots in the cult of quantum, they'll tell you what virtual photons are. I'll get to that in a second. Stuff like that actually perturbs and aggravates the piss out of me because ignorance is okay. One of the first statements of wisdom is to say, I'm ignorant, I don't know what the answer is. Okay, that's okay. When you pretend you know and you write books and colleges, which people pay, countless tens of thousands of dollars to go get an education, are made to read crap like this and told that this is the nature of things. That's the crap that makes me sick. That makes me sick. He's asked, well, how does magnetism work? How does one magnet attract the other? But that's the questioner's answering it. And he's flipping back and forth. He talks about Aunt Minnie slipping on the ice. It's ridiculous. That Feynman and others have declared, as he did in his book, Q.D. Strange Theory of Light and Matter, that magnetism is mediated by virtual photons is no different than the Pope declaring that Mother Mary is healing a sick child from a pendant worn around the neck. I don't care what your beliefs are, but I'm actually comparing the two, that there's no empirical evidence for any of it. And I'm not an atheist at all. Ultimately there is a substrate to phenomena. I'm a hardcore Platonist, so obviously there is noumena underneath the phenomena, but I'm not going to get into that here. Humanity is placed as department chairs in countless universities, and likewise head of mathematics and physics departments. People quite literally like him are insane. They're deep thinkers, but insane ones. Actually, Tesla warned about people that were deep thinkers but insane. He was actually referring to Einstein and others and referring to deep thinkers that were insane. The insane asylums, are full of genuinely deep thinkers. There's some real geniuses that are deep thinkers in insane asylums, but it's not for the sake of deep thinking that they're locked up away in padded rooms inside insane asylums. They're insane. And people like this, they are insane, because I've been through their works. I'm not just basing this upon one video that the moron made. You saw him sitting there wiggling and twitching and squirming in his chair like a frog on a hop. He doesn't have the answers, which is fine. But don't write books saying you know the answers. Virtual photons. Let's take a look at virtual photons, because this is how the cult of quantum, and it is a cult. It's based upon stuff that is not the input or output of any experimentation. There's no empirical evidence for it whatsoever. None. Let's take a look at virtual photons. So taking a cue from quantum mysticism, You know, when they asked the expert, you know, since you declare magnetism to be mediated by virtual photons, what are virtual photons? You'll have to dig into really deep stuff to find the answers, because I know it's BS. I mean, anybody with half a brain knows, well, this is BS, you know. Here's their answer from their own mouths. A virtual particle is an abstraction which facilitates the calculation and understanding of things. The term is very vague and loosely defined. They never appear as the inputs or outputs of experiments. Their existence is questionable at best. However, they are very useful in rendering concepts and making equations balance out. So in other words, when you start dealing in theoretical physics and field theory, which fields are not particles, okay? Since fields are not particles, they are not measurable inputs or outputs. You can measure the effects of fields, how it changes something vis-a-vis electrical charge, whether it's gravitational, electrical, magnetic, or dielectric, but fields themselves are not comprised of particles. Nobody can quantify quantum, okay? You cannot quantify something that has no empirical basis in reality. When I say reality, I mean it doesn't exist. No, I mean reality as in the sense that it is existential, it is empirical. It can be quantified. Because everything in the universe is fields, and fields are not particles. And that is what these idiots know. That is the silver bullet to these vampires. That is the sunlight on the skin of these intellectual vampires. They're idiots. They are absolutely demonic. I know all their secrets. I know how to shut them up like that. All you have to do is ask them one thing. What's a field? You know, they'll fumble and fiddle around and ask them about instantaneous IAAD, instantaneous action at a distance. They can't answer that. Because to them, everything is mediated out by unicorn particles and angels. I mean virtual photons. Which don't exist. These are conceptual constructs, no different than angels, unicorns, leprechauns. Any sort of absurd crap that you would see in a cartoon is more real than what the cult of quantum tells you mediates out fields interactions, okay? Which, I mean, how insane is that? It's okay that humanity is not progressed enough yet, or is not evolved enough yet to not know the answers. Okay, so we just don't know yet. That's okay, because when you don't know, then you start looking for answers. But when idiots like this, I mean, these demented a-holes invent stupid crap that has no basis in reality, that is empirically no different than saying, well, how does the magnet... And this guy asks a serious question. He asks it very simply. How do magnets work? You know, what is magnetic attraction work? Well, you know, and at the end he says he doesn't know. But he creates this whole fantasy, and at the very, very end of the video he says, well, it's just too complicated for you to understand. Oh, okay, well, that's a good answer. It's too complicated. Well, if it's too complicated, then how come in all your advanced writings, Mr. Apparently, because the people in the cult of quantum say, well, this question is just too stupid. He just couldn't give him an answer because he couldn't have understand it. Well, let's dismiss that and go to Feynman's own books. This is one of them. And I've been through all of them in his articles. Anytime he talks about magnetism, I've done a deep search. No answers anywhere. And it's okay not to have answers, but don't pretend you've got the answers. Don't. I say, let's go again. Virtual particles and abstraction. Facilitates calculations. Very useful in rendering concepts. Okay, they never appear as the inputs or outputs of experimentation. Okay, what is a virtual? Okay, the cult of quantum says the entire basis of the universe, which is fields, specifically in reference to magnetism, they themselves say they never appear as the inputs or outputs of experiments, but their existence is questionable at best. Well, that's no different than saying angels, unicorns, or leprechauns. Is what mediates out magnetic... there's no such thing as magnetic attraction or repulsion. Is dielectric avoidance and counteravoidance. There's only one field, and that field has 4 modalities. It's no different than saying water and ice and steam or separate entities. They're not. They're all hydrous oxide. Water molecule modalities. These are all ether or inertia modalities. Gravity, electromagnetism, dielectricity. Okay, these are all ether modalities. They have different attributional variants depending on whether they have transverse components or not. But stuff like this from idiots like Feynman, this guy had 1,000 charisma points. People loved him because he was a good storyteller, but he was a demonic idiot. And if there's one thing that pisses me off the most is that the entire universities across the entire world laud this guy as, you know, the guru of quantum mechanics. And he was nothing more than a moron. A moron! Thanks for watching. Catch you later.